Hello, we are glad to welcome you again on our channel. Today we present to your attention the fairy tale Cinderella.
Once upon a time, in a peaceful kingdom, surrounded by deep green forests and bright meadows full of wildflowers, there lived a kind and gentle girl named Cinderella. She was the only daughter of a wealthy merchant who loved her more than anything in the world. Her mother had died when she was still very young, but her father did everything he could to make sure his little girl was happy and cared for. When Cinderella's father decided to remarry, he chose a woman of high status who had two daughters of her own. They were proud, cold-hearted girls who thought themselves far superior to everyone else. At first, Cinderella hoped that her new stepmother and stepsisters would become her friends. She tried her best to please them, but from the moment they arrived, the stepmother's jealousy took root. She could not bear to see how beautiful, kind, and graceful Cinderella was, for her own daughters were selfish, rude, and lazy. Not long after the marriage, Cinderella's father became ill and passed away. The poor girl was left alone with her cruel stepmother and her two vain stepsisters. From that day on, everything changed. The stepmother turned Cinderella into a servant in her own home. She was forced to do all the hardest chores, cleaning the floors, washing the dishes, tending the fire, mending clothes, and cooking every meal. Her fine dresses were taken away, replaced with rags and old aprons. She slept not in a soft bed, but in the cold attic among the ashes of the fireplace. That was why they mockingly called her Cinderella, the girl of the cinders. Despite her misery, Cinderella remained gentle and kind. She never spoke a harsh word to anyone. Each morning she rose before dawn to begin her work, and though her hands grew rough and her clothes were ragged, her heart stayed pure. Often she would sit quietly by the hearth, whispering to the little mice and birds that came to keep her company. They were her only friends, and they loved her dearly. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, the king and queen were preparing for a great celebration. Their only son, the prince, had reached the age to choose a bride, and the king wished to see him married. So they decided to host a magnificent ball and invited all the noble families of the kingdom. "Perhaps," said the king, "among the lovely young ladies of our land, my son will find one who can win his heart." When the invitation arrived at Cinderella's home, her stepsisters were overjoyed. They spent days choosing gowns, ribbons, and jewels. They forced Cinderella to help them, sewing hems, ironing their dresses, polishing their shoes, and brushing their hair. Her stepmother ordered her to work faster, always scolding her for every little mistake. "Mother," cried the eldest sister, "imagine if the prince were to fall in love with me." "Nonsense," laughed the younger one. "He'll surely fall for me. Everyone says I have the prettiest smile." Cinderella smiled quietly and said, "You will both look lovely at the ball." Her stepmother sneered. "And what about you, Cinderella? Would you like to go?" "Oh, yes," said Cinderella softly, "but I know I have no gown to wear." The stepmother smirked. "Then it's settled. You'll stay here and clean while we are away." At last the evening of the ball arrived. The house was filled with excitement. The stepsisters put on their richest gowns. Their hair glittered with jewels, and their faces were painted and powdered. Cinderella helped them until the very last moment. When their carriage rolled away, she stood at the gate watching until the sound of the horses faded into the night. Then she sat down beside the hearth and wept bitterly. "How I wish I could go to the ball," she sobbed, "just to see the lights and hear the music." Suddenly, a warm light filled the room. Cinderella looked up and saw a kind old woman standing beside her, holding a silver wand that sparkled like starlight. Her eyes were gentle, and her smile was full of love. "Why are you crying, my dear?" asked the old woman. "I wish I could go to the ball," Cinderella said, wiping her tears, "but I have no gown, no carriage, and no one to take me." The woman chuckled softly. "I am your fairy godmother, and if you truly wish to go, then you shall." With a graceful wave of her wand, she transformed a pumpkin from the garden into a shining golden carriage. Then she touched 6 little mice who were nibbling crumbs near the fireplace, and in an instant they turned into fine horses with glossy coats. A fat rat became a coachman, and 6 lizards from behind the watering pot became footmen dressed in green and gold. Now, my dear, said the fairy godmother, we must find you something to wear. She tapped Cinderella's ragged dress with her wand, and it turned into the most beautiful gown imaginable, woven with silver threads that shimmered like moonlight. Around her neck appeared a necklace of diamonds, and on her feet were glass slippers so delicate and bright that they sparkled with every step. "Oh, thank you!" cried Cinderella, her eyes shining with joy. "But remember," warned the fairy godmother, "you must leave the ball before the clock strikes 12. When the last chime sounds, the magic will end. Your carriage will become a pumpkin again, your horses will turn back into mice, and your gown will return to rags." Cinderella promised she would remember. Then she stepped into the golden carriage, and off she went to the palace. When she arrived, all heads turned toward her. No one had ever seen such beauty. Even her own stepsisters did not recognize her. The prince, who had been politely greeting his guests, froze as soon as he saw her. He bowed deeply and asked for her hand. All evening he danced only with her. He was enchanted by her grace, her kindness, and her laughter. The music played, candles glowed, and time slipped away faster than Cinderella realized. As the clock began to strike 12, she gasped in alarm and ran from the ballroom, leaving the prince calling after her. She fled down the marble steps so quickly that one of her glass slippers slipped from her foot. She dared not stop to pick it up. The moment she reached the garden gate, the last bell tolled, and in a blink, her carriage was a pumpkin again. Her horses were mice, and she stood alone in her ragged clothes. But she still had one glass slipper left. The next morning, the palace was in an uproar. The prince had declared he would marry the mysterious lady who had vanished at midnight. All he had to find her was the glass slipper she had left behind. So he sent his servants throughout the land with orders that every maiden must try it on. The slipper was carried from house to house. The stepsisters tried their best to force their large feet into it. One even tried to squeeze so tightly that she nearly cried with pain. But it was no use. Cinderella watched silently as they failed again and again. When the royal messenger asked if there were any other young women in the house, the stepmother scoffed. "Only my servant girl. She's too dirty to see the prince." But Cinderella stepped forward and curtsied politely. "May I try the slipper, please?" The stepmother tried to stop her, but the messenger insisted. The order was for every maiden in the land. Cinderella sat down, slipped her foot into the slipper, and it fit perfectly. At that moment the fairy godmother appeared once more, waving her wand. Cinderella's rags turned back into the glittering gown she had worn to the ball. The stepsisters gasped, and the stepmother sank to her knees in shock. The messenger bowed deeply and said, "Your Royal Highness has found his bride." Soon after, Cinderella was brought to the palace. The prince met her at the grand staircase and took her hand. "I knew it was you," he said softly. "You are the one I have been waiting for." A few days later, they were married in a splendid ceremony attended by all the nobles of the land. Even the stepsisters were invited, and Cinderella forgave them for all their cruelty. She said, "Let us live in peace, for hatred brings only sorrow." From that day forward, Cinderella and the prince lived happily ever after. The kingdom rejoiced, the bells rang, and the stars shone brightly over the castle where kindness and love had finally triumphed. And whenever someone told her story, they remembered the lesson she had taught, that true beauty lies not in riches or fine clothes, but in a gentle and loving